Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth issue of the Retails podcast with myself and Toby Barnes. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Jolly good. Still sunning yourself out in Joshua Tree, I see. All right. For
the magic of publishing dates.
Yes, exactly. Well, today we've got a wonderful chap called Richard Hammond joining us from the company Uncrowd. And I met Richard just over a year ago. And Uncrowd have a fascinating offer in that they will take a whole range of data and model it and look at the potential impacts between what he calls the frictions and rewards of retail. What are the barriers to engagement and the potential rewards from adding them or removing them as well? And I think this is particularly relevant as we're nervously looking at the post-pandemic world and everyone is trying to understand what's going to be happening in retail. I don't know what you think about this, Toby, but I've not seen anything that's been very convincing so far in this area.
No, it's really important. I mean, I think with the UK, the store's opening on April the 12th, and there's a lot happening here in the States. I think what we've seen is that really there's kind of people fall into four areas, like four personas, if you like. On one end of the spectrum, you've got the people who are just refusing and they don't want to come out. They're kind of the germaphobes of the world that are refusing to come out of hiding, still relying on their Instacart orders until like everyone's been vaccinated. And on the other end, you've got places in the States like Miami and Florida and Texas where over spring break last week, people were just, COVID's over, let's go, taking masks off and partying like it never happened. And you're seeing spikes come, inevitably from that. But I think reality is that most people fall into two camps in the middle, which is kind of the group that are very much still keeping the masks on, being very sensible, kind of only going out if they have to, if they're honest. And like that social shopping side of things is low on their list at the moment. And then there's another group who are just desperate, really keen to kind of find that social side, whether it's like putting their foot into going to restaurants or going to stores.
Yeah.
So I think those four groups have got very different behaviors, very different experiences. And it's incredibly hard to kind of model and understand which one of those is going to be the most important.
I agree. Well, let's let Richard into the call and maybe he can explain a little bit more about how they do things. Just waiting for your video to connect, Richard.
Yeah, we're there.
Fantastic. Hi, how are you, Richard?
Very good. Yeah, how are you guys? Good to see you.
Good. Nice to meet you, Richard.
Yeah, very well. Toby's swanning himself out in Joshua Tree at the moment, so we're not going to give him any sympathy whatsoever. He keeps when we're having calls, switching his laptop and showing the view out of this place he's staying in, which is very annoying.
I'm missing California very deeply, so yeah.
I keep complaining about there's too much sun and it's ruining my view and so on. Which
no sympathy whatsoever. Well, thank you for joining us, Richard. I was just explaining to Toby and the viewers or listeners that I've known you for probably just over a year now, I think, maybe a little bit longer. We were introduced by a mutual friend and I was absolutely fascinated by the way that Uncrowd does things, but I won't try and explain it. You do a much better job than me. So if you could just explain the principles of Uncrowd and how you go about doing things and helping clients.
Absolutely. And of course, the second time we met, Ian, was when you walked past my co-founder and I in the garden of a pub in King's Cross.
It was on the way to the train station. You made me stop
entirely randomly. Yeah, absolutely. We forced you to stop for a beer. Is how it worked.
You did. I put up such a fight. I can remember very well. Yes.
Just very briefly then, before we get into the fun stuff of chatting about this stuff, Uncrowd had to exist. I'm a retailer of 35 years and I've been obsessed by this idea of understanding preference. Why does a customer choose one retailer instead of a different retailer? And actually, as it subsequently turns out, why does somebody choose one brand instead of another brand, or one vendor or one service instead of another? And I had to write a chapter for the fourth edition of my retail book, Smart Retail. And I thought there would be a metric to measure this. And I thought that it would probably exist in another vertical, that maybe us in retail had just missed out, that there was some way of measuring preference that had been lost to us. And actually, it turned out that the 2 days I'd set aside to essentially cut and paste somebody else's working into my chapter in the book was messed up because MPS doesn't do it. Customer feedback tools don't do it. Those traditional kind of customer efforts, survey tools, all without exception of the feedback mechanics are essentially useless for understanding whether somebody's going to shop you again or shop you in the first place in preference to somebody else. So it forced me into filling this chapter, because you've got a publisher waiting who's going to get on your back if you haven't done it. So I thought, rather naively, I'll take a crack at creating a metric that can do it. And I thought maths was obviously the right starting point. Can we use maths to describe customer human behavior? And I took two things. I took economic utility theory, but kind of as expressed by the philosophers, so Bentham, John Stuart Mill, that kind of humanization of that idea, and then combined it with Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman's work on two-system thinking, and eventually mashed all that together and came up with a comparison set, because you need a comparison set to be able to understand if you're going to be one thing or another thing. And that comparison set is a metric we call friction versus reward, which is essentially a way of understanding how much effort does a customer have to put in to shop a particular way versus what do they gain from having done so. When you've got those two things together, you can start to understand, well, the likelihood of somebody in a given situation to prefer to flow towards this option is X, and the likelihood to flow towards that option is Y. But what's different about it is it's straightforward in its ability to take into account things like emotion, irrationality, the value of design, the impact of ease versus something being worthwhile. And actually kind of summing it up in an example from Toby's world, very, very much from Toby's world, the queue outside a branch of Supreme when they have a new collection dropping. Now, queuing in retail is something we always look at as a friction, isn't it? We always say queue's bad. It's a metric we have. We can reduce queues. That queue outside of Supreme is not a friction at all. It's a reward. It's a badge of honor. It's that person in the queue saying, me being here is because I know fashion better than you do. Me being here means I'm going to get something that you're not going to get. And I mean, there's all sorts of lovely complexities beneath it, but that, in a big old fat nutshell, is what we're doing at Uncrowd. Is we're taking that metric, because I've put the metric out in another book, Friction Reward, for anybody to take advantage of, because I think that was the right thing to do. At Uncrowd, what we've done is we've turned it into an analytics platform. So, on a big macro scale, if you're I don't know, if you're Walmart, or if you're Albertsons, or if you're Tesco's, whoever, and you need to measure this right across a business, across millions of transactions, we give you a version of the metric that does that.
Interesting. And how does it take into account kind of different groups of people? Before you jumped on the call, we were talking a bit about COVID, and we're talking about, we did some work around kind of very different types of personas, and the early work we were doing was very much, we felt people were going to be very nervous to come out when we were opening stores back in June last year, and we got it very wrong. Actually, people were really, really keen. To your point, the reward was really worth that risk.
Yeah.
And so we were really struggling, especially with some of our outlet stores, with queuing mechanisms and things. Yeah. So how do you deal with the kind of different types of people and the different kind of personas?
It's a really important question. So for a start, we have a philosophy on personas that's quite important here, which is that I don't believe that having a fixed persona or an assumption of persona for an individual customer is very helpful, because what tends to happen is we wake up as one customer. So first thing in the morning, broadly who we are is set, but then contextual things will change the way we react to situations during the day. So for example, if I read an article on the internet about sustainability at lunchtime, I'm more sustainable to sustainability messages for the next 3 or 4 hours. So when I go and buy my lunch, I might be slightly more indexed to sustainability than I was. Sustainability, it's not a very sustainable word, is it? To how I was yesterday. How I buy, well, in fact, there you go. But how I buy my lunch, I will probably do in a very different mindset to the way that I buy the ingredients that I'm putting together for a birthday meal with my partner. Or it might be very different to the picnic that I want to put together for me and the kids at the weekend. So what we do instead is we say, if you can't know that, and you can't use current segmentation tools to say, Toby's going to be this shopper throughout his experience with us, Ian's going to be this shopper with us. What you do instead is you say, what mindsets, what personas, if you want to call them persona, what mindsets just exist around my business normally? So are there certain types of mindsets that are likely to be in my customer audience at any given time? And Nike is a great example. You can fairly accurately pick a set of those potential sets of mindsets out that would very closely resemble a given group of customers at a given time. Some of those people, though, and this is where it gets really interesting, they can be a different person the next day, or they can be a different person if they're shopping online or if they're shopping Saturday. So you need two bits of information in answer. You need an understanding of the mindsets that naturally exist around your business. And on the other hand, you need to understand what people are trying to do. If you've got those two things, then you can start to apply sensitivities to your customer reality. So, and that's where our approach is novel, because I talked about using these two theories. Essentially what we do is we create a grounding, a foundation of observable, quantifiable truth without any context, deliberately without any context. And it's essentially hundreds of kind of measurement points in a store or in a website or in a shopping app. And essentially that granularity is just looking at what is the objective reality here? How many of these things are there? Does this thing exist? Does the retailer do that? And if they do, how much of it or how little of it?
Yeah.
If this is differentiation, what does that mean? Are these 6 things in evidence in this space? If they're not, they're not. If they are, they are. What that means, though, which is great when you ask that question, once you've got that objective reality, you can then layer on top of it the emotion, so the mission and the mindset, because that then indexes the likely sensitivity to each one of those realities. So, queuing is that great example with the Supreme example. In the Supreme mission, queuing changes. But if there's a professional shopper in that Supreme queue, then for them, with a very different mission, but in exactly the same situation, their frictions and rewards index differently. And whether you're at a Supreme, you then get a chance to decide, do I care about that professional shopper? Would I actually like to make it worse for them, because I'd rather that real people, or my objective measurement of what a real customer is, get my product before somebody who's buying products then sell on eBay or sell for a customer who's ordered it gets it.
It's interesting because I think that there's also the variable of product as well. I think one thing at Nike we find is like, if it's about a Jordan 3, people will fight for the Jordan 3. If it's a Pegasus, it's not fair to say no one cares, but no one cares. And that's the point of the product in some ways, not a high heat product. We have 9 tiers of product. And so there's another variable of the type of product. And you can have the same consumer in the same environment, but have a very different thought about whether it's a pair of sweatpants or whether it's a pair of Jordan 3s. So it's that variable of product, environment, and people. Super interesting.
So the way we capture that is you capture that in the mission. So we talk about long tail. So a mission could be it's the drop of a new sneaker, but the long tail is the drop of a new Jordan sneaker, the drop of a new whatever it might be. And you can add those sensitivities to your heart's content to say, does that additional bit of codification in the mission then have an impact on some of the sensitivities of the truth beneath it? And that's how you capture that, which is pretty cool, because it means that you can get to hundreds of combinations if you want, and you can then objectively say, well, actually, this Pegasus, is that am I better off investing all of my effort behind promoting that in my online channels, or am I better off promoting it in a live environment? Which ones are important to the people who are on that mission? That starts to get super exciting.
That's really interesting, because what that could inevitably mean, and I'm doing that terrible thing talking to an analytics person, I'm going to guess something, and I'm not basing this on any actual data other than things I've thought in the past, but you could get to a situation where you find that you're going to over index or over promote your Pegasus in store, because actually that's a wandering crowd who come in on a Saturday to hang out. Whereas I'm not going to put the Jordans in the store because I know that they'll sell out anyway online, and I'll put that in because there's a brand value to that and less of a shopping value. The challenge to that is, it's something that Ian and I spoke about ages ago, was one really important thing that we've discovered at Nike is consistency of message. And so that if we are talking about, I don't know, Air Max Day, that you'll see Air Max, very heavily on social, very heavily on through the direct channels, and also if you go in a store, that message will be repeated, so that there's just an inherent understanding of what that happens. And if you segment audiences too much, you may lose that consistency of voice.
See, again, that's where this
and then I'm going to
really... Go on,
sorry, I was just going to finish that and say, and ultimately where I've got to in that whole ramble is that, but that's the beauty of good marketing. If you can actually then work out how to do a really strong message that is consistent, but has different experiences or different executions based on the product, which is super able to do that. We've been doing that for years.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, it's exactly that, Toby. It's that from the beginning, being able to say, so you think about the time it took you as a team to work that out, to work out that consistency was important. What a lot of us have is we don't have enough time, frankly, to get to that position. We want to know, is that the reality right now? And what an approach like this does is it allows you to say, with modeling right at the beginning, right, okay, let's look at the value of consistency. Let's look at the value of offer clarity. Let's look at the, whatever granular set of things are related to that particular. And you can then say with real certainty, well, actually, if we split this launch across these different areas and we don't feature it consistently, that's going to affect offer clarity. And we can see here that offer clarity really indexes highly in whatever it might be, X, Y, Z. Or you might say that our ability to influence trend setting is in part one of the signals beneath that is our consistency of message or our consistency of challenge or whatever it might be. And that's what gets the hairs on the back of my neck standing up on this, because just to sort of finish the positioning on it almost, I never intended to become an analytics person. I was running a consultancy where I was perfectly happy. I was doing lovely things like format development. I did BP's Forecourt of the Future. It was one of the best, in fact, one of the best client briefs I've ever seen. They gave us a single sentence and it said, we've discovered that a visit to a forecourt is 7 minutes everyone hates. Please advise. Which is just when you want a client with open mind. That was incredible. And I'm really proud of it. We did such awesome work there. But I do things like leadership for Kingfisher and Sony. I help them to understand how to position themselves at retail and that kind of stuff. The books were only ever a way of writing essentially a big fat calling card. It was the equivalent of a business card that somebody could sort of remember a bit better. And so I wrote that chapter and I started getting bullied. I started getting people coming to me constantly saying, this looks like an analytics platform. Why are you not doing that? Why are you not dropping the business you're perfectly happy with, earning a lovely life with? I could afford sheds in the garden like this. Why aren't you doing that? And actually, it took, in the end, I kind of deflected. I said, I'm going to write a whole book on just this thing now. So there's clearly a lot of interest. I ought to just see actually if the chapter's worth of guesses I've made are real, which is when you go from a chapter to an entire book about a subject, you then have to research it and test it and challenge it. And I was finishing off that version of in fact, it's up. Of course, it's up there. We stick it in the background, hope people notice stuff. Finishing that off, my partner Emily, she tends to kick me out of the house for a couple of weeks when I'm towards the end of a book deadline, because I become a complete pain in the arse. And I just stick a pin in the map. Wherever the cheapest Google flights are, I'll go there. So I'm in Sofia in Bulgaria, and my mate Rocky, who's now my co-founder, he said, look, I'm going to come out for half of that. And this friction reward thing that you've been getting bullied about, well, you run a retail consultancy. He runs a tech business. He was thinking, if there is something in it, then we've got the resources to test it, to at least put together something that. And anyway, I mean, we're raising Series A finance at the minute, so we tend to embellish this story a bit. And Rocky says, "Oh, and we were in restaurants and these cultured and civilized places in Sofia, trying to test it." We weren't. We were in pubs that occasionally would give you a little plate of sausages on the side, just arguing and thrashing through this thing and trying to find the problem with it, trying to find the broken bit, because it's so obvious once you get under the skin of it that you go, why hasn't anybody else done this before? And that bit's been the most fascinating bit, that kind of discovery that actually we don't even feel like we've invented this. We feel like we're the archaeologists who dug it out of the ground and are kind of the first to hold it up to the sun and blow the dust off it and start to get a chance to make sense of it.
Like identifying ley lines. They've been here for thousands and thousands of years and really, really important, but no one knows what they are. Like, oh, it turns out Roman roads were set up on them, and it turns out so are motorways. And yeah. It's one of the things that I just kind of thinking about why it hasn't happened. And one thing that I know for previous clients we've had is one of the reasons that people don't do that is just that there is no data. And it's not even that there's no, it's not even like there isn't yet, or that there is so much data that no one knows what to do with it. And they were sold an analytics program 10 years ago, and they're collecting the wrong data in the wrong place, and they're not giving it to anyone else. And the analytics team are creating silos and will create a PDF report, which is not it's got graphs, which is not the one you wanted. Yeah. That may or may not be true of many places that I work at. But I think the true sense of data, I think, is really hard. And I think there is a lot of, over the last probably 10 years, there's a lot of vendors who are promising red laser to computer vision in store, to many ways of doing it. I've not seen many people actually invest in it. Like one or two have, and there's some really good examples. You mentioned Microsoft earlier. They have a retail lab in Seattle, which is an incredible playground of, it's like a mall, which each individual store, there's a computer game store, there's a grocery store, there's a coffee shop, all made, and they're not real, but you can go in and they show off all their technology. But one of the things they have there is like cameras above the computer games, the boxes and stuff. So if you put your hand over and reach for a box, it knows which product you've picked up and which you put, and then you put it in your bag and so on. The number of people who have actually done that is probably, I can count on one hand. So how are you dealing with the kind of data collection side of things at scale?
Yeah, because I mean, you're exactly right, Toby, and there's two things around it. The first is that there's a tendency to overcomplicate data capture. There's a tendency to use exactly those tools you've talked about, and I won't name them because they're very, very generous and kind to us. But there is one tech giant that has a similar setup to the one you've just described, and it's in the UK, and it's a UK retailer. And I've been on calls with them in the US where they talk about it as being a real store that really exists, and the client's really using this thing, which is just horseshit. It's not. It's a warehouse in Peckham, and that's the extraordinary thing of them trying to will it into existence. But the reason it's not used is because it doesn't work. It doesn't work properly, and so somebody will break that at some point. Intel got some really interesting ideas. HP got some really interesting ideas, but it's still kind of a mountain of problems to solve. What we did is very different to that. Initially, I assumed that with all these dead end vendors and all these dead end tools that are out in the market, that actually there would be more data available, and we would just extract from that what we needed. It was very quickly clear that wasn't true for two reasons. The first was the silos that you talk about, but the second too is that a lot of my retail colleagues are just really dead scared of asking to try and extract data. It's a project that turns into a project on top of a project, and all sorts of, and there's a reason why things like Tableau and ThoughtSpot are doing as well as they are, because they are liberating finally that data in a very different way. So we took a different view of it. We said we needed to do something slightly different here, which was to break down that measurement of reality in such a way that, frankly, a pair of perambulant eyeballs could observe accurately and correctly. And so that's exactly what we've done, is we break down the picture of what reality will consist of in any given retail sector into hundreds of questions, generally a couple of hundred what we call signals. And a signal is anything you can vary the value of. So can you do more or less of a thing? And then that wraps up into a friction variable or a reward variable, which is kind of the thing that describes the thing you're putting in or taking out. And then what we do is we just go and complete those visits. So whatever we need for statistical significance, about 20 visits per node, we'll go and do hundreds of those using a smartphone app that we developed, and an army of perambulant eyeballs that we have access to all over the world, who are used to entering both physical and virtual store environments and observing stuff.
Yeah.
So it's not asking customers anything, because customers tell lies. You can't rely on any feedback you get from a customer. It's not deliberate. It's just the way that the world works and the way our brains work and the way our memory works. You know, that amazing thing of memory is connected not to the thing that happened, but to the context and environment in which you're describing what happened. You know, the way I'll remember something at a conference on a stage is very different from the way I'll remember it in a conversation like this. And if Rocky's to be believed about Sophia, we were in a totally different city altogether.
Once you've spent money on it, it changes everything as well. So I've just
God, yeah. Oh God, yeah.
Bound to tell you it was much better than it was the other thing I didn't buy.
Yeah, it's exactly that. So what we do is we've essentially broken it down into a structure that just doesn't need somebody to be taught how to do it. That isn't an audit, but also isn't a mystery shop. So it isn't anybody pretending to be a thing. They're not pretending. But what that does is that allows you to get a completely consistent view of not just the client company, but all the competitors. And it also means, you know, grocery is a great example. It means you can compare Deliveroo with Tesco's. It means you can compare HelloFresh with Co-op, you know, and that's just not been possible to do before. You couldn't get a selection set that was consistent across those. You'd have to make a lot of leaps of faith. And that's the really important for me in this whole thing is none of the output should be dependent on a magic number that you find from outside of the platform. So every number must be inside the analysis in the first place, because then you've got a better chance of getting an accurate picture. And what we've discovered, if you do that, is that actually, even if you're 5% out, you're consistently 5% out across everybody. So if it's a peak, it's still a peak, but it might be 5% higher or lower, but enough to not actually matter very much. It's still an obvious thing to do instead of somebody else. And that's the thing, is that we talk a lot about ourselves. That's a human thing. And we do it as companies. We talk a lot about ourselves, and then we don't talk enough about the reality elsewhere. And what you'll know about this yourself, I'm sure both of you guys, that you become very aware of your flaws. You become very aware of the things that you're less proud of, and you over-index those. Whereas your competitors and rivals, you'll often assume that they've got a better answer to something than you have, or that their flaws aren't quite as pronounced as your own flaws are. And to be able to then try and correct that out is just impossible. Humans can't do it. We need a support that's different.
It's funny you mentioned that. One of the things I found at Nike, which I didn't understand until I actually worked there. So I worked with them for 10 years on the outside and then kind of moved inside. It's one of the only companies where there's very little talk about competitors. Like most other companies, you know, when I was working with other competitors, like you'll hear all about you'll hear all about the companies, like look at what they're doing.
Yeah.
You'll get reports on them, you'll get more study of those. One of the things at Nike that I think is one of their huge values that I don't think is really well understood is they don't talk about Adidas, they don't talk about Under Armour, they don't talk about Lulu. They're obsessing about the consumer, and it comes from that Jeff Johnson thing of really understanding who's in your shoes, how are in the shoes, obsessing about the product, obsessing about innovation, obsessing about the experience, all those things. They don't really care, and it gives them, I mean, they're lucky because they're a leader, but I think most leaders are always worried about who's going to take their position. And actually, by not worrying about that and still thinking that without using a sport analogy, you know, you can go faster, or you've still got to get the finish line. I think that's one of the things that's given them the power. So it also reminds me of I did some work with Netflix a long time ago, and some of their original ways of thinking about how do they know these things, and why do you get the weird sets of like dog movies with Tom Hanks in, and they used to put, in their I call it cafeteria, that's very English for me, in their break room or whatever it was called, where they had the restaurant and they had all the things, they have this big whiteboard, and literally anyone could write a test on that whiteboard.
Yeah,
and cool. It was just any engineer could say, right, I'm going to take the one. And so they would just do random 3-part tests. So, okay, I like Angela Jolie, I like action films, and I like Bulgaria. Okay, how many of those? And then they will go run a test and see, okay, they'll A/B test that against something else. And then it turns out so do thousands of other people. Then I go, okay, well, we'll make that into a grouping, and the groupings get elevated, which is why you see these random choices. But that human element of just putting a test on this whiteboard and an engineer going, that's cool, I'll take that. I think that seems to resonate with me when you're talking about there's no number outside of it. They know everything about their experience, and they know what their consumers are doing in their experience. They're not wondering what else they're doing, and they just test on that. And so they know what the power of those variables. And if they're wrong, they're all wrong. So it doesn't matter.
And that's the great thing about having an all digital environment, is that you're able to, you own every point of that relationship. And it's one of the things retailers have struggled with. And actually, if you're an online only retailer, and I hate this expression pure play, because it just doesn't exist. There's no retailer that doesn't want to sell to more customers, as evidenced by Amazon never calling themselves a pure play, and never calling themselves an e-commerce retailer, only ever calling themselves a customer business. Is that one of the challenges you have is that all product is physical, but engagement can be either physical or digital. It can be replicated in both channels, but it means that the physical still exists somewhere in that relationship, and the physical is grotty. It's broken. It's unpredictable. It's different. You know, I'm on a street in Oxford here right now, and if I took the 50 people either side of me, you'd have 101 very unpredictable, very different, shaped, attitudinally, all those kinds of things. I mean, I'm in a city, so my neighbours are a combination of all classes, of all outcomes, of all, you know, I've got a professor from Balliol at the end here. I do what I do. My neighbour, Kevin, drives a van for Argos. You know, we're those combinations of crazy differences. And when you're in a retail environment, as opposed to a brand environment, particularly, understanding what the relationship between those customers are and really understanding what those customers want from you becomes very difficult. And one of the challenges that we've had is that retail in general has thought of itself as a logistics business, and the customer is just another link in that logistics supply chain. And that's the big thing that people like Nike have been able to so fabulously demonstrate, is that actually, if you instead take the customer out of the supply chain and make the customer the thing you're building for, and the combination of differences that you're trying to reach, and then making sure that each time you hit a rich seam, you then double down on that rich seam, that then has a real period of a real power to it. The challenge for anybody else who isn't Nike in the marketplace is that A, Nike have already done that, and B, Nike have not done that overnight. They've not done that in a decade. You know, that's a 20-year job. So I don't know, JD Sports have not got 20 years to spend time doing that. Adidas actually haven't, Puma haven't got 20 years to do that. You know, that's the thing about the difference between leaders and alternatives. But what we also know, and I love this, is that all empires fall. At some point, Nike will be a shriveled husk of itself. Now, that might be 2 billion years in the future. It might be 10 years in the future. It might be tomorrow. It might turn out that there's some shift of, you know, when we all go outside our houses and get a chance to walk again, that we suddenly, in fact, I'm saying this because I've got a dirty, great big hole on the back of my foot from a pair of Merrells that removed the skin yesterday that I hadn't worn before, which is bloody annoying. But anyway, if anybody from the Merrells is listening, probably my fault rather than the product.
So you're after a free replacement pair there, Richard.
Well, not like those bloody ones, because they'll just take
maybe
off
a different version, perhaps.
It's honestly the size of a 10p piece. I'm looking at it now. A 10p piece, that internationally doesn't play, does it?
It doesn't.
No. But well, even like hard cash doesn't really work anymore.
No,
exactly. Hard
exactly.
cash in 18 months ago.
Yeah, but so the point I'm trying to make is regardless of kind of the stuff we do, it's that.
Well, I think
if you look too internally and you only ever look internally, that can only work providing that internal also includes this thing we call customer, and it does it in Nike. It really clearly does.
I think that you're explaining my success in. So I've only been in retail for 4 years, and I wouldn't even describe myself in retail. Like before that, I've been involved in all sorts of things, mainly kind of it's somewhere between the physical and digital. And so mainly started off as a consultant, then did a lot of computer stuff. And so I've built apps and websites and so on. and then fell in love with stores and doing retail when we developed a thing called Trial Zone with Nike, which was basically we put a basketball court in a store and we kind of created experiences in stores. Right. But it was actually a very digital experience. We developed it and built it like a website. It was built completely with Agile, very iterative. We were able to switch out from projectors to screens to all these other things. The interesting thing for me about one of the reasons that Nike's been so successful is because of Mark Parker was a designer. And at the beginning, he was put in charge by Phil and various other people to really lead that company and grow that company. And as a designer, you obsess around two things. One, the craft of what you're making, and secondly, the consumer, who you're making it for. And so I think that those two things are some of the things that you see businesses that are accelerating unnecessarily or kind of unexpectedly. Airbnb is another one. Brian's a designer. The CMO is a kind of ex-Apple designer. So you have these organizations where they obsess those. Now you're starting to see, and I'll say starting, I mean IDEO started this, but you're starting to see the role of design and design leadership being far more important in businesses. And I think if you can harness that, I think that's what gives you the success. I think it's really interesting that it was a shorthand when I came in to do retail and like being successful because I've always obsessed the consumer's voice. I've always thought in systems. I've always thought in, never thought in one channel or another. And then suddenly it's like, oh, we can change this whole thing because we have had like retailers for 40 years who are saying this is hugely innovative and you want to kind of go, it's not really, it's just the way we've been doing it in the past. And I think,
do you know why so few retailers do that?
No.
Because they can't measure it. Because they've never been able to measure it, and it takes too much nerve. It's too brave for them. So the reason that basketball court in a retailer that wasn't as design focused and didn't understand the value of people like yourself and Mark, in a retailer that was frightened to open up to that.
The argument we had about square footage, like
it's productivity. So the productivity of a basketball court is dog shit, but the value of a basketball court is gigantic in terms of saying this is a place to connect sport and fitness and the game with what's happening. And that's where this gets really fascinating. There's a great crossover example of Ron Johnson at Apple. So the Apple Store was created by an exec from Target. And you'd go, hey, well, hang on, Target, that's a pilot high, sell it reasonably cheap. But what Ron Johnson did is he was a retailer who was open to say, I've worked out coming into Apple that Apple exists and is successful because of a different set of metrics to the metrics that Gateway and Dell have been measured on. So I'm going to open myself up to see whether that concentration on usability, design, function, and the form following that function perfectly, I'm going to see if I can apply that to a retail environment. And a lot of what the Apple Store did is low productivity. But the flip side of this stuff, and this is why retail needs more of your thinking in it and more ability to measure, which is what we do, the value of the irrational or what looks like the irrational. We use an example of why traditional.
If you wind up, sorry, Richard, we've got about 1 minute 20 seconds left, so please finish. I'll just wind you two. I can sit and listen to for hours.
Boots is a great example. Boots put the baby stuff on higher floors. Boots is like a Walgreens in the UK. In fact, it's owned by Walgreens now. Boots put the baby stuff on a upper floor because it's low productivity. Diapers, nappies are huge. Wipes are huge. Low cost. Productivity is nil or is really low. Parents hate that. Because I've got a pram with me. I've got to go upstairs because I've forgotten to bring enough nappies with me. Boots, I hate you. Somebody who does that differently is going to get my business. That irrational looking thought beyond the metric is why we exist. And actually, it does tie up both of us. It's why people need more of that design thinking and that customer-led thought in those environments. Break out from the metrics and think about the human being.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end there. I hate that being the boring timekeeper, but I literally could have freeze framed my face, gone and get a cup of tea and put my feet up and just carry on listening to you two. I mean, it's so excited about the two of you meeting and it's just been an amazing conversation. So we're going to get cut off any second. So thank you very much, Richard. Thoroughly enjoyed that. And maybe in the future we could return and continue this conversation again.
Fantastic. Loved meeting you, Toby. Great stuff. And thanks for asking, Ian.